Hi, everyone, and welcome to Post the Protest, How to Impact Change After You March. I'm so excited to be here for this action-oriented webinar conversation with Maria Yuan from IssueVoter. She's the CEO and founder of IssueVoter, and my colleague Simone Lero, who's the community lead here at All In Together. And today we're going to go over a quick intro of what All In Together and IssueVoter do. Afterwards, we'll talk a little bit about the context of this conversation, about who's marching and the most recent research about how to effectively march. And then we'll lead into a conversation about what you should be doing after the march to really maximize your impact. And we encourage you all to join the conversation. Both All In Together and IssueVoter are on all of these social media platforms, so please follow us on all of these. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, let us know. There's a chat box that you can enter any of your questions, and after the conversation, we'll have a Q&A portion, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and your questions. So be sure to enter your questions in those chat boxes as they come to you during the conversation. Great. So to give a little bit of background on All In Together, AIT equips voting age American women with action-oriented, nonpartisan civic education to realize their full potential as leaders shaping our nation. So what that means is we go all around the country, both in person and online workshops like this, to really help women have the tools and education they need to be leaders in their community. We talk about things like how to make an effective call to your congressperson, or conversations like this, what you should do, say, if you've already been involved in activism after a march. So given our mission, the team at All In Together loves IssueVoter as a tool. They make it so easy and effective for you to stay informed about important legislation that's going on. So I'm excited to turn it over to Maria to talk about what IssueVoter is.
Great, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I learned about All In Together probably over a year ago now. Actually, Elisa Rayner introduced me to your founder, Lauren Leader TV, and I've attended one of All In Together's workshops. So if any of you have not attended yet, I definitely encourage you to. They're really great. They walk you through the whole process of how to have an impact and how to do it in a way that fits into your life. So as you guys know, I'm the founder and CEO of IssueVoter, and I'm just going to walk through some quick background about how the idea came about and what IssueVoter is. So my dad came from China, where democracy does not exist, and so the importance of being civically engaged was something that my parents always emphasized from a young age. And inspired by my parents, I went to work as a campaign manager in Iowa, where people are super engaged during elections, but like most Americans, disengage in the off season. And from that experience, I also saw that engagement on issues was high, yet we would vote people into office, but there wasn't necessarily that accountability to see whether we were actually being represented. And so that's where IssueVoter comes in. Some of you may know this, but over 10,000 bills are introduced each session of Congress. About 1,000 of them are voted on, yet we're only hearing about a handful on the news. You might have heard about the healthcare bill, the tax bill, the DREAM Act, but meanwhile, new laws are passing every single week. But I definitely understand that bills are hard to research and understand, and typically, the way to communicate with your reps has been really outdated. You either have to pick up the phone and call, or mail something in the mail, which hardly any of us really do anymore. And petitions are really ineffective. I'm happy to talk more about that or answer questions about that, but generally petitions are not going to be the most effective way to make an impact. And so IssueVoter is politics made simple, and here's how it works. So here, take my friend Amrita, for example, and she cares about the economy. And so she can choose that issue on IssueVoter. And what she'll get is these alerts in her inbox that describe the bill in layman's terms, along with bullet points from both sides. And we only send alerts on bills that we know are getting a lot of attention or a lot of floor debate, because again, we don't want to overwhelm people with the 10,000 bills that are introduced. We want to alert you when it's really going to be time to make an impact. One click sends your opinion directly to your rep's office. And then we're the only site that really provides a scorecard that shows you year-round the percentage of time your rep is voting, how you would want them to vote. And we hope that this will help people be more informed voters at the next election. Especially primaries. So I think that what we're seeing right now is that a lot of primaries are yet to come. So we're based in New York, for example, and New York's primary is in 2 weeks. Many of your states may have already had primaries, but a lot of them are still coming up. So I definitely encourage you to find out when your primary election is. We did make an interactive map that shows you your primary date. So it's we can probably link it at some point in the comments, but it's basically it's primarydates.strikingly.com is our map where you can basically just find your state and see when your primary election is coming up. Because I do think that primaries are super important, because you may not feel comfortable necessarily voting for someone of a different party in the general election. But in the primary election, you can vote someone that is, of the party that you affiliate with, but while, potentially finding a candidate that represents you more than the incumbent. I think there's 3 things that really distinguish IssueVoter. One is that we focus on issues, not parties. About 40% of voters are registered as independents, and according to Pew Research, about 48% of millennials do not identify with a political party. We focus on emails, not petitions. Reps, staffers really track everything, and electronic messages do influence their decisions, their bosses' decisions. And it's frustrating because 90% of Congress is re-elected despite this 13% approval rating, because I think historically we didn't know if we were actually being represented.
Great, thank you so much, Maria. And in addition, right, so primaries are on everyone's minds right now because these midterm elections, as always, elections are incredibly important. There's no such thing as an off year. So this is such an important tool in our current political context. Another thing I want to talk about today is the context for this conversation specifically, which is what at All In Together we laugh and call it March Madness, which is the reality that since the 2016 presidential election, approximately 20 million American women have attended a march or protest. Whether that's been one of the women's marches or the March for Our Lives, a lot of people are using protests and marches as an advocacy strategy. However, a lot of people have been frustrated because, at least for some of these more recent marches, there haven't had a lot of legislative successes directly as a result of these marches. That doesn't mean that marches and protests don't work. There's been a lot of research done specifically on the marches during the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s that show a pretty direct correlation between these marches and a lot of that legislation that we talk about today, whether that's the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. Kind of this mass mobilization around protests and marches do have a really big impact. And the research shows that, particularly from that time period when we saw really effective marches, that there are 3 factors that make a difference in whether or not protests really work. The first of these factors is organization, right? So the idea that protesting really isn't enough. Protesters have to be organized in a way that lets them continue to push for their movement's goals. So when we talk about organizations, think of kind of really consistent grassroots meetings. So not just meetings to organize, to make sure that you have permits to do the march itself, but what are you doing to keep people engaged after the march? The second one that's related is messaging. So the message for a march needs to appeal to people who aren't necessarily the movement's core supporters. So it's important to frame your goals in terms of common core values like equality and freedom that people, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of background, often will agree on. And then last but not least, the third factor is momentum. So the protests that really have successfully impacted legislation are the ones that are effective at changing hearts and minds in the long runs, right? So it's not even these more short-term victories around legislation. It really moves the needle on people's perspectives on these issues. So what that means for you is if you go to a march, be sure to bring your family and friends to a protest, even if it might not be their thing, even if they're not super passionate about this issue as you are. You can really maximize your impact if you create momentum by bringing more people to the cause. So the research shows that those are the 3 biggest things you can do to ensure that your march is successful. But if you notice a commonality that these 3 factors have, it's clear that the marches in and of themselves aren't necessarily what it is that impacts change. It's what happens after the march that really moves the needle on the issues that we all care about. So with that in mind, I'm so excited to have this conversation with Maria and Simone. They both have such great experience on making impact outside the context of a protest. And we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do after the protest to keep up your organization, to keep up your momentum, to keep up your messaging, to really have impact on these issues. So thank you so much, Simone and Maria, for having this conversation with me. I'm really excited to have y'all both here.
Of course.
Yeah. So to get started, if both of you could just tell me a little bit about what you did before getting involved with your current organization and why you made the switch to get involved in your current organization.
So I mentioned a little bit of this earlier. I was a campaign manager and saw the immense amount of focus on elections and thought, what happens the rest of the year when the real work that affects our lives gets done? But I think even going back before that, I think it really came from growing up in a family that was very civically engaged. I still remember mock voting in second grade. In college, had the unique experience of introducing and passing a bill with a group of students in our student government in this Texas state legislature. And I also worked for a rep. And when I worked for the rep, the thing that really stuck with me was the fact that when constituents would call, it was my job to actually answer those calls and tally them, and either calls, email, whatever channel they used. It was really, I was the one that was tallying that and really seeing that information was captured and, did make a difference. And it was something that the office looked at. So that was something where I felt like, oh, people don't know, or people don't always realize that contacting their reps is impactful.
Totally so. So hi everyone, my name is Simone and I'm the engagement lead here at All In Together. And before this, I was at the White House under President Obama, where I led online engagement work for the president. So what that meant was making sure that government was more accessible to people all across America. And so as Maria alluded to earlier, we live in a very different age than we did when we were first thinking about what the right to petition your government meant. And so clicking an online petition on a various amount of sites that we all get forwarded to every day is not always the most effective way to impact policy. But we worked to make sure that all Americans' views were represented and meeting them in new ways, whether it was through a Facebook bot or groups all across the internet and chat rooms, and bringing people who were serving in administration to communities that wouldn't hear from them. So joining All In Together, I got to kind of do a similar work of closing that gap between people and the government that represents them, but from the other side. So teaching people all across the country how to have the biggest impact when it comes to making policy changes and advocating for issues that are important to you, no matter what your stances are.
That's so great. And for both of you, what would you say is the most common question that you get when it comes to effective civic engagement?
So many, and I'm excited to hear from Maria as well. But one of the most common questions I get is, I live in a blue area or I live in a red area. Why does it even matter, right? So here in New York City, we hear that a lot when we're doing workshops, and folks are like, oh, I know that Senator Gillibrand or Senator Schumer is going to vote the way I want them to, so why does civic engagement even matter? And it's so interesting because I think that what Maria touched on with the idea that 90% of our Congress is reelected every year, but yet they only have a 13% approval rating, there's clearly a discrepancy. And so thinking about that, where you live is not always the most important thing when it comes to your civic engagement, and particularly when you think about prioritization. So just because my representative may be blue or red, and I might be too, doesn't mean that I'm seeing what I want to see happen in Washington and also in my most local levels, like my city council and my state representatives. So, even in an era that was blue and progressive in the Obama era, there were still things that didn't happen that I, as a progressive, really wanted them to. Things like the immigration reform or criminal justice reform. These are all areas that had we been more civically organized and engaged, we could have let our representatives know that they were a priority. So I continue to do that today, is speaking up even in the most local level, when it comes to calling my city council member and showing them that the pothole on my block is really frustrating when I'm riding my bike over it, to then the bigger picture of that I care that families aren't separated when they enter this country. And so I think that at all levels, it doesn't matter if my representative happens to be the same color party that I am. There's a lot more work we need to do.
Yeah, I want to just add on to that. So this isn't necessarily my most common question, but I did want to add on that, well, two things. One is that we actually can see from data on IssueVoter that even if you think that your rep is representing you because you think that you are aligned, you know, on both on the left or right, they might not necessarily be on every issue. So I actually spent some time in San Francisco last summer and had a number of people come up to me and tell me, oh, after I started using IssueVoter, I realized that my rep, Nancy Pelosi, is not representing me on everything. I mean, I'm not trying to single her out. I think that is actually the case for every rep. They might not be representing you on every single issue. And there's so much data out there that it's sometimes, you know, I think before IssueVoter it was like impossible to know that. The other thing I would just want to add is, you know, if you agree with your rep, I do think that having that data and sending them your opinion to reinforce their vote is actually helpful to their office, because then their office can say, look, I'm voting with my constituents. But they won't actually have that data or know that unless you are contacting them, even if you know that they're going to agree and that they're going to vote your way. So I still think that that's something that they want.
Totally.
The question that I think I get, well, there's really, I almost want to say two, can I say two things?
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
Okay, so one common question I get is, you know, what about calls? Aren't calls more effective? And I would say that it's not that they're ineffective, but now with technology, it enables so many more voices to be heard. With calls, there are only so many hours in the day. There are only so many staffers. We're never going to be in a situation where even 10% of constituents can get through. Most Congress people have about 700,000 constituents. So it's just, you know, the channel, there's a bottleneck there. You can't always get through with your call. And, you know, so a point that I like to make is no matter how you contact your rep, it is tallied. So at least know that. And, you know, I do think that times will change. I mean, sometimes we feel like government is the last to adapt to technology. But if we think about ordering food from a restaurant, we can go to the restaurant. We can call, we can go pick it up, or we can have it delivered to us by ordering online. And no matter which way I order my food, I still want it to taste good. And so I think that historically in the advocacy world, you know, they have this story around the more time you take, the more effort you take, it means you care about the issue more. But I think we're going to have to move away from that. And like, just because I'm contacting my rep online doesn't mean I care less. The other question I get that's most common is is like specific to IssueVoter kind of, is how do you ensure that your bills are not biased, or that your summaries about the bills are not biased? And the way I answer that and the way I think about that is every bill is inherently biased. It is introduced by a Democrat or a Republican, many of them are bipartisan, that thinks it's a good idea. And we're merely summarizing it. And we're showing you bullet points on both sides, and those are summarizing people's opinions. So I think it's really hard in the policy world to create a perfect analysis of policy and pros and cons, because we can't predict the future. There are a lot of unknowns. So you put a policy in place based on like the best information that you have, and potentially things like data, historical outcomes. You don't always know how it's going to turn out. So I think that that's one of the challenges with policy, is you don't always know what the results are going to be. But we can tell you what the arguments are on both sides.
I love that contrast. I think that's so important. And I think for my next question, I'm really interested because I think both of y'all touched on in your answers that in any administration, in any session of Congress, right, there are tons of issues up for debate. There's tons of bills on the floor. What issues are each of you passionate about? And how do you end up deciding that in your own kind of limited advocacy time, where you end up putting your time and effort, right? Because these are limited resources for all of us.
For me, I think the issues I get most passionate about are the ones that I know the majority of Americans support, yet Congress has done nothing. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily like left or right. It's things like 74% of NRA members support background checks. There are things out there that I just feel like are common sense, and why aren't we doing them? Campaign finance reform is another one. You know, typically if you ask people, I mean, we know, like, it's like, I forget the exact stat, I think it's 87% or more Americans are for campaign finance reform. So there's just these common sense things that don't get done, and that's what really frustrates me. And I think for me, it's like, if we can have more people participate and have more people's voices heard and hold our reps accountable, then we can force them. I mean, I think I'm still idealistic. We can force them to compromise.
I totally agree. And I think that's also where I see myself spending the most time, issues that feel as though if we lived in a true representative democracy, we would have different policy, right? And so that can take all sorts of different forms. But when I think about where I want to be spending my time and how I want to be spending my time, I want to be doing so where I can be most impactful. So I want to be leveraging my own experience and my own skills to see where I can help move the ball forward the farthest. And I think that that changes all the time, and that's good because my own experience is therefore qualifying experience, right? So if I have a family member who is struggling with a pre-existing condition, that's inherently experience when I'm then trying to inform my legislators about how that impacts a certain potential policy or other sorts of areas. And then I think about like my own actual skills and where I can make the most impact. So, you know, I have experience in digital and amplifying voices. And so those issues that have amazing stories that just aren't being told, maybe that's where I can make the biggest impact and how I can kind of drive change by amplifying stories from those who aren't being seen and being heard by our legislators.
Awesome. No, I love to hear how much both of y'all are really emphasizing impact and what we can really be doing. And right, so we can have impact in even the issue priorities we choose, but also in the advocacy tactics we end up employing. What are y'all's biggest pet peeves when people are trying really hard to be good advocates, but they're missing the mark? What are things that people are doing that, quite frankly, are a waste of time and that they could have more impact?
So my pet peeve is petitions. I alluded to it a little bit. And I think, I mean, to be really honest, petitions are for list building. That is literally what they are for. They are just for organizations to build their lists. And not that I have any problem with that. I mean, you know, IssueVoter, we want more people to know about us. Like, but I think the unfortunate thing with petitions is for people signing them, you feel like you're having an impact and you feel like you're doing something that's, you know, going to make a change. And petitions there are situations where petitions can be impactful on a smaller scale, but petitions, you know, I firmly believe a petition is not going to change anything in national politics.
Sure.
And it's really just for list building for organizations to be able to go back to those individuals and ask for donations. Again, I don't have anything wrong with that. Like, they need donations to exist. But let's not like fool people into thinking they've done their civic duty by signing a petition.
Totally, especially a petition that isn't going to the person that represents them.
Yeah.
There's another area of pet peeves I would say is that there's a lot of clickbait and email forwards that tell us to contact whoever it is, whether it's the majority leader, the minority leader, etc. down the line, or people sponsoring a bill. But ultimately, people who are elected to Congress are elected to represent the people in their district. And unless there's some kind of area of expertise that you have that you want to help advise a committee on, things like that, kind of your by and large, you should be contacting the person who represents you. And we see that happening time and time again. And I totally agree with Maria on the petitions aspect. It is inherently a list building email collection tool. And I think furthering that, you really want to share why you're contacting the legislature that you are. So there's a reason that you're taking time out of your day to, whether it's sign a petition, hopefully it's not, to send a message to Congress, right? So share your personal story and why this matters to you, because if anyone out there is as much of a nerd as me and you're watching C-SPAN, they're not reading off, you know, the numbers of petition signers that they got. They're reading off the stories of constituents that are impacted by a bill and how they're impacted by a bill. So making sure that you're sharing why you care about an issue and why you're taking time out of your day to advocate for it is very important.
Simone, that was such a great segue into my next question. I wanted to flip it to the positive side of what are the advocacy strategies that really energize you, that really make you excited that we're going to see the impact that we all want to see?
I'll say one of the things that's really exciting to me is the push for voter registration and voter turnout that we've seen attached to some of these marches. Because Colleen, you mentioned when we started off that that marches inherently themselves aren't always the most effective advocacy tool just by showing up in a day, but the momentum that can come from them is huge in advocating for an issue. And so I love seeing how much people have prioritized getting folks registered and turning people out and sharing information about different deadlines that can sometimes frankly be quite confusing. You know, when's a primary deadline, when's a general deadline, all these different aspects. So seeing that as a priority for the marches has been really exciting because I can't even imagine what our democracy would look like if we had everyone actually participating in it. That's so exciting to think about.
I think the thing I'm excited about is I'm seeing more and more people taking the time to research and to like really understand things. So we've had users on IssueVoter tell us like, before IssueVoter, I didn't even know there could be another side to the issue.
Wow.
So it's not that we're necessarily changing someone's mind always, but even just opening people's, worlds up to new opinions. And I think people are starting to seek that out more to actually understand what the other side is saying and understand, a level below just what we're seeing in news headlines. And, taking the time to register to vote and taking the time to learn all of this, I mean, I definitely realize that it can be time consuming and I applaud people for that. But I think it's time well spent. It's important.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you were saying about the importance of getting a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the other side. I think especially in the context, right, we're talking about what you should do after a protest. And one of the most effective parts of a protest, again, isn't necessarily passing legislation, but it's that changing hearts and mind that might help us change legislation in the future. Kind of what other tips other than just, reading both sides of the opinion on IssueVoter, like how do you talk to people about maybe seeing other sides of the issue? What are your strategies for like crossing aisles of difference in this way?
Totally. I think that's one of the most important things right now. In an era of polarization, it can feel really daunting to even start to open the door. And I think when I think about talking to someone who has different views than me, I think about starting from a place of assuming best intentions. It's so easy to think that like someone, hates children because you feel this way about an issue. It's probably not the case. So we probably are all trying to strive for a country that's more, that we're all doing better, right? And so when we're engaging on an issue that feels difficult, assuming best intentions, assume that we all want to make our country better, but we have different ways of thinking about it. And isn't that great? Like we need different views. We need people who are challenging each other in order to get the best policy that we can possibly get. But let's not approach it with the idea that, I don't know, someone's maliciously attacking everything that we stand for, because that's probably not the case.
So actually, I just earlier this week went to a talk. There's an author, her name is Patricia Roberts Milner, and she wrote a book called Demagoguery and Democracy. And in this talk, she shared some of her opinions on how do you change people's minds, and when you're having these talks, like how do you have these so the point about how do you have these conversations. And she said one of her tips was, which I really liked, was to approach it from an angle of do unto others. So she gave an example of how she was working on something environmental related, and it actually became really, it kind of started, it went to religion really quickly, which I don't think I would have necessarily expected. And she talked about how a lot of times, if that happens in a conversation, the idea of do unto others is something that people really everywhere, coming from anywhere, can kind of relate to in that context. And that's a way to think about, like if you're having a talk about, like, say, immigration, for example, and thinking about fairness and how you treat people. So I thought that's something I hadn't heard before. And so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, well, because I feel like that works on several levels, right? Just from how do you frame issues so we're all kind of appealing to the same values, but also just how you're conducting the conversation, right? And how do you transform this conversation? And this is a problem we both agree is a problem. How do we fix it? Rather than a you're right, I'm wrong conversation. Because I think it's that threshold that we need to pass to really start having these conversations.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think before we wrap up this part of the conversation and go to what other people want to ask, because I've been spoiled and gotten to ask you all of my questions, I want to ask just top line message. If you could ask people to do just one thing to be more civically engaged, you know, this week, this month, this year, what would that be? Is it something you've done? What great things came from it? Walk me through that kind of top line, number one civic engagement tactic you would give.
So besides signing up for IssueVoter, I would say register to vote, because there's, we hear these very negative stats in the news about US voter turnout. But what we don't always see is that it's something like 80% of people who registered actually vote. So really, once you register, there is something about that where you're going to be more likely to vote. So check your, voter registration status and register.
Totally so.
Yeah.
And you can do that at vote.gov also.
Yeah.
If you don't know how to do that right now, start finding some resources there. I would definitely echo that for sure. Voting is the just total cornerstone of our democracy. And I would also say that in terms of one thing that you can do, it depends for everyone. And so I would challenge you to try one thing that you haven't done before. Because if we think about civic engagement, it's kind of this staircase of engagement, right? So every step that you've taken just leads to another step that what you can do. So if you've never called someone that represents you, call someone that represents you and tell them about why you either agree with what they're doing or not agree with what they're doing. And the biggest thing is bring 3 friends with you on the staircase of engagement.
I love that.
So take really one step yourself and bring 3 friends with you, because everything that you do is only exponentially more impactful by those that you bring with you.
No, that's so true. I love both of those answers, both so important. But I also love these great questions that we have from our attendees. So to start out, one person is wondering, what are the best resources for getting reliable information on the issues that I care about, and how can I be sure that these sources are accurate? This is such an important question right now as we're getting ready to take our actions.
Totally. So one thing that we talk about sometimes is deciphering the news can actually be kind of tricky because there's like the actual news, what's happening today. And then there's these other areas like features and commentaries and op-eds, which are not the unbiased, unopinionated news. They are really great in terms of understanding how events and policies are impacting different communities, how we're getting different perspectives, and they totally have value. But it's important to approach all of these with the knowledge that they're not inherently just the news, right? And particularly when we're seeing these on like greener sites that we all end up to through Facebook or email forwards or Twitter, making sure that we're being critical consumers. So if you're looking up and you're like, wow, that's so surprising, I would have never thought that, give it a fact check, because it might not actually be something that is reliable and can be backed up. And so when we think about kind of deciphering all of these, the news sites that are well established and have been around for 100 years, they have everything to lose by publishing information that isn't true, right? Versus then the greener sites that are just trying to make a name for themselves, they don't have that same incentive. Their incentive is to get out there and to be noticed. And so they have less accountability when it comes to really reporting the facts and the true news. So making sure that we're being critical consumers.
I think also actually clicking the links. So I am actually the same author that I mentioned earlier. She talks about how she goes and really does a lot of research on the internet to sites that I'm sure I have never heard of. I mean, really kind of very extreme neo-Nazi things that are out there.
Sure.
And she says oftentimes when you actually click the link, like you get beyond the headline, it'll bring you to like, sometimes it's an ad, sometimes it's like total spam. It's like for, just something that's not even related to that headline at all. Sometimes her like virus blocker will come up and it won't even let her go to that site. So I think that's an extreme example. But even for just typical Facebook links and articles that your friends are posting where you see the headline, I would say like click beyond the headline and actually look at what that is.
Totally. And where are they getting their conclusions, and like how did that like very clickable headline become the fastest, easiest.
And the other thing too is like we America, our news is, we're kind of in this culture where we think of certain news sites as unbiased, right?
Mm-hmm.
Different from the UK, where their approach is different. They come right out and they say, we are the news site on this side. We are on this side. And so I think also recognizing like the source and reading news from different sites and then kind of forming your own conclusion.
Totally. I think it's a President Obama quote that just says, read widely, because it's wonderful to see all these different perspectives and to understand how we're landing in such different places. But in order to make sure that you're not just kind of seeing the tip of the iceberg, read widely and see kind of what all these different perspectives are, which is one of the wonderful things about IssueVoter, is getting to see why people are thinking different ways and what their rationale is. But it's kind of a similar sentiment when we're thinking about how we're getting our news.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great. And our next question is also news related. I love this. Someone is wondering, how can I get more engaged and informed around local issues that aren't always in the national news? And this is such an important question because often you can have a massive impact in your local area, right? Because your representatives, say at the state and local area, they don't represent as many people, all of those reasons to stay informed and have impact on the local level. Any thoughts?
So one thing that comes to mind is that what's so exciting about local issues is that they're happening right here and now. So showing up is like 80% of the battle when it comes to local. So don't underestimate the power of town hall meetings, school board meetings, kind of all these public forum areas that are basically showcasing what the community cares about right here and right now. And they're also a great place to raise issues that no one's talking about right now, which can be, again, something as local as the pothole on your street, or it can be something more about, like a policy in schools that are keeping kids down, things like that, that can really be remedied pretty quickly and can be something that folks aren't focusing on until it's brought forth in these public arenas.
Absolutely. So it looks like those are all of the questions that we have time for now, but I really want to encourage everyone to stay connected and keep in touch with us. You have email addresses and social media handles to really continue this conversation, because I hope that this really important conversation really is just the beginning. There's so much to do post the protest, but thank you so much for tuning in during this Thursday, and yeah, definitely stay connected with us. I'm really excited to see what everyone ends up doing after the protest. Thanks so much to Simone and Maria for this important conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.